for those of you that don't know, I'm Ergo. I do a lot of the manual research for the OXT research team, which is led by Laurent MT, the OXT dev. I don't think he's here today, but shout out to Laurent. And what I'm going to try to do at kind of a very high level is go over our most recent OXT research report on the Kucoin hack. So the first goal of what kind of we're going to talk about is that I want to go over the report, kind of hopefully answer kind of anybody's questions. I'm trying to get a feel for kind of how the chat looks right now. Who's in the chat, who's going to have what kind of questions. It looks like we've got a little bit of a diverse kind of audience. Some of you will have read the report, some of you won't. And the report's a little bit technical. So really what I want to try to do with this chat is more give kind of a high level explanation for what we did. It'll be a little bit easier to hear it kind of coming from me, and we can drop some visuals in the chat, and we can talk about those kind of as we go. But one of the other things that I was hoping to do was spend a couple minutes walking through at least the first transaction graph from the report. And especially for anybody that's on desktop, it'll be pretty useful or pretty helpful to you if you can open the bookmark to the transaction graph from the report. I'll drop the link in the chat, and so if you're on desktop, you can open that up and play with it a little bit, and we'll spend a couple minutes on that. And hopefully, I'll give people the opportunity to ask some questions, especially about the transaction graph. And then we'll kind of continue on with the report. So I kind of want this to be, pretty informal. It seems like we've got, 30 or so, a couple more than 30 people listening. If you guys have any questions, feel free to stop me as we're going. Like I said, I'm going to try to keep this high level. We won't get super into the weeds. Hopefully we can save that for kind of the end, the questions that come up at the end. I guess that's kind of it. So, given a bit of the intro, I expect people will keep trickling in, but, I'm basically going to plan to get started now. Does anybody have any questions before we get started? I'm going to take the silence as a no, and we'll get started. Okay. So I see Bitcoin Q&A dropped the link to the report in the chat. If anybody hasn't, you can click on the link, download the report, and have that kind of side by side. You should try to do that if you haven't already. And kind of in the meantime, we'll just sort of get going. Let's see, so in early September or late September, Kucoin, a Hong Kong-based exchange, had a bunch of crypto stolen. $280 million worth roughly at the time, spread out across Bitcoin, Ethereum, Litecoin, and a bunch of other stuff. We, primarily focus on Bitcoin. So we kind of ignored a lot of what was going on with the other coins and basically focused on the 1,008 Bitcoin that was stolen roughly at the time. And so about a month after the hack, what we kind of found was that the 1,000 Bitcoin that had basically sat dormant for a month started to move. And as we tracked the flows of these coins, what we found was that about 470 were sent to the custodial tumbler chip mixer, and about 530 went through a slightly different process that was involving, at least Wasabi coin joins and, I'm just going to call it another entity for now. And so, we spent some time sort of getting oriented and observing these tumblers. And for those of you that don't know, when we use the term custodial tumbler, we're specifically referring to, kind of the original sort of, what people would have called Bitcoin mixers at the time. And the role of these services is to basically act as a swap service. You deposit coins, they take, custodial possession of those coins, and hopefully they give you, a different UTXO or a different set of coins with a different history in return. And so these present kind of a bit of a different challenge than sort of attacking a traditional coin join, because that sort of swapping acts to break the transaction graph, which makes the analysis a little bit more difficult. And what we're sort of reduced to, at least sort of what we did in this overall kind of as the report, was basically a volume and timing analysis. And so this is kind of the details involving that. So if we sort of move along, you see that's sort of the first couple of pages of the report. And if you're looking at the report now, we sort of get into a timeline, of the flows. Here's that for anybody that doesn't have the report up and isn't looking. This just sort of breaks down kind of the roughly daily timeframes of what we kind of saw. And again, the hack happened in late November. The coins basically sat until late October, when we started seeing them about 470 sent to a single address. And then we saw the transition to sort of a different process that kind of appeared to involve Wasabi coin joins and another entity. And so if we sort of keep following along in the report, we get to kind of figure 3. And this is one of the things that I want to spend a little bit of time on. So figure 3 is the first transaction graph. For anybody that has this up, or sitting at their desktop, you can click on the link, you can open up the transaction graph, and you can kind of get it and compare it sort of side by side to what we have in the report, if you have the screen space. If you don't, we'll walk through it a little bit. Let me get the image and drop that in here while we're at it. Here we go. This is what I'm specifically referring to. So for those of you that don't have, OXT on desktop kind of available right now, this is the first transaction graph that we talk about in the report. And I know we plop this on Twitter, we plop this into the reports, and I just know for a fact that a lot of people are still kind of unfamiliar with, the transaction graph feature, just kind of in general. And so, to talk about that, just sort of briefly, the purpose of, these transaction graphs is to evaluate the financial flows of the Bitcoin, associated with sort of whatever you're kind of observing on chain. And so what these graphs show, the lines represent UTXOs, inputs or outputs to a transaction. And the circles represent transactions themselves. So if we have, kind of this transaction graph, from this first figure 3, point A starts with, a consolidation of all of the hacked or stolen outputs. And if you're surfing through OXT right now, and you have the side by side, you can click on all the inputs to this transaction, and you're seeing that they're all from basically the same address. If you click on the transactions that are inputs to this, you'll see our Kucoin labeling Kucoin wallet B. Kucoin's basically cold wallet. There's another sort of wallet involved here. And you can sort of start to get kind of a sense for what we're sort of talking about. This transaction was, this shows basically the hack in process, and then the first transaction after the hacked coins move. The coins get split basically into 2 UTXOs. If you're looking at figure 3, the top of this transaction graph, part B is a 200 Bitcoin peel chain. We'll talk about that a little bit. And the bottom is an 800 or so Bitcoin peel chain. And, it's not quite clear sort of in the figure because we don't have the amounts. But if you're looking at the transaction graph in OXT, and you sort of go along the peel chain of from B to address, you'll see we start with a 201 Bitcoin output, and you see, just sort of small amounts get, what we call peeled off and sent to that same address, 17VU7 ... And what we're seeing here is what we would describe sort of as basically a standard peel chain. And, peel chain has gotten a little bit of a connotation kind of thanks to chain analysis. They implicate it as, basically a money laundering technique, basically sort of a financial structuring technique that is designed to circumvent exchange, basically compliance software. Rather than sending, all 200 Bitcoin in this peel chain in one transaction, you do it over several smaller transactions, and this is, in whatever context deemed, slightly suspicious. We don't necessarily, view kind of peel chains as suspicious. It's just a visual of how we kind of explain the transaction graph and the associated flows. These are simple Bitcoin spends. One input and two outputs. And, I don't know, something like 50% of Bitcoin transactions look like this. And without any context, you could call it a peel chain, you could call it kind of whatever you want, but really it's just kind of a simple spending. And as you sort of follow the inputs and outputs along this part of the transaction graph, what you'll see is the smaller pieces are chopped off and sent to that 17 VU address, or VU address. And the change amount, is the blue part, or the blue line, that just continues making small deposits to that same address over and over again. And, this sort of is kind of what we would call basically, a classic peel chain with several small payments and a change output. So that sort of is the top part of the graph, and the bottom part of this graph is, basically the same process, but instead of 200 Bitcoin peel chain, it's an 807 Bitcoin peel chain, and each transaction spends, basically to the same address again, that same 17 VU address. And sort of when we get to the end of this transaction graph, we move over to the next figure, which would be sort of figure 4. So if I could just summarize entirely what's going on in this transaction graph is, we're basically seeing this, the same entity paying to the same destination over and over again. So does anybody have any questions on the transaction graph that we have up before we kind of move on to the next thing? I saw there was some OXT chatter earlier. People needed some clarification. So does anybody have anything? Guessing that's a no.
Hey guys, Max.
What? Yeah, hang on.
On the peel chains that you've been created, is there much more logic than just like taking of the kind of UTXO when it's paying it out? Is it just assuming that whatever's the largest of the two UTXOs is the change, or is there some other kind of heuristics that you're using there?
Yeah, there are a couple of heuristics that you can use. The simplest would be something like the input address is reused as the change output address, right? And the payment address becomes painfully obvious because it's not on both sides of the transaction, right? That would be another sort of heuristic that you could use. And there's a couple other ways. There's like sort of a strict change heuristic, which I don't want to call strict, because again, it's a heuristic, and heuristics are shortcuts that work a decent amount of the time, but break down if you try to really apply them without any context to sort of a larger kind of data set just at random. So like I think an example of sort of that strict change output would be if you have a P2PKH address that's on both sides, an input and output, and a change address, or possibly a payment. Weird hearing voices. Yeah, Ashlyn. You have a separate payment to a new address format. That can sort of be assumed to possibly be the payment, and that sort of helps you sort of boil down what the change address would be. And in the context of sort of this transaction graph, this is pretty obvious. It's basically the largest output is the change. And to add a bit more context, because it's making the same payments to the same address over and over again, the change output becomes even sort of more obvious, if that makes sense, right? The payment is the smaller output that's always going to this 17VU address, and the change output is basically the largest output that comes back that isn't, paid to that single address.
Makes sense, yeah. So,
okay, anybody else?
I would like to ask a question.
Sure.
In the figure 3, where is the same address that's getting paid over and over again? I just see a trail of transactions. In which node is that address that is getting paid over and over?
Those highlighted orange lines, that's the same address. So if you're on OXT and you hover your mouse over that address, you'll see it now. You'll see that same address over and over again. And it's impossible for me to include all of this information in the figure that goes in the report. So the reason that I wanted to do this was I knew exactly that question was going to come up. How do I know? It's not shown on the figure. So that's it. That's why I wanted people to hopefully get their hands a bit dirty. So that's a good question.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Anybody else? Max is typing. I'm going to guess no further questions, and we'll keep.
Happy New Year's, everyone. Happy
New Year to you too. So we'll keep going on with the report. So that was figure 3, and if you've got the report side by side, what we're moving on to is sort of figure 4, which picks up at that last point of figure 3 and continues on. There's about 534 Bitcoin remaining, and I'm going to plop this figure in the chat. Here it is. This is figure 4, and we'll sort of talk through this a little bit. Let me see. There you go. Okay, this is figure 4. This picks up where figure 3 leaves off. And what we're seeing is sort of this continued kind of peel chain. We've got the very large UTXOs that are pretty obvious on the left side of the transaction graph, right? And those are smaller sort of payment amounts that are being made. And what I've done in this transaction graph is isolate kind of a small portion to describe kind of the overall scene of what's kind of happening here with this mixing. And what we kind of see is basically a chunk of these early UTXOs are sent to Wasabi mixing, partially mixed. They're swept one at a time out, basically a single line, right? And then consolidated into sort of a follow-up transaction that has, it looks kind of noisy if you're not, if you're sort of just getting into looking at the transaction graphs for the first time. The peel chain is pretty clear on the left side of the graph. Wasabi in the center has kind of another distinct, fingerprint or distinct visual with lots of UTXOs being shared and the distinct change outputs that are, basically easily traceable. And then the sweeping to this new entity, which, this is the second time that we've come across this entity. We've seen this we had seen this before in the previous report, the China and North Korea report, basically this same process. And so now that we had seen this again, and we've seen it in an even better context, we kind of had a feeling that something really is going on here. It's not just, Wasabi being involved. This, second part of the transaction graph, this D and E, the sweeping of individual UTXOs and the apparent consolidation, we kind of had a feeling that something was going on here, and we'll talk a bit about that kind of as we keep going. I'm going to assume there's no questions. We'll just keep moving. So anyway, to kind of summarize all of that, 470 or so Bitcoin were sent to Chip Mixer. We didn't quite get to discuss all of that quite yet, but the remaining 530 were mixed through this sort of other process that we talked about in figure 4. And let's keep moving on. Let me see. Okay. So in the report now, we start to set the scene and talk a little bit about the technicals of a Bitcoin transaction. Max asked earlier, what kind of heuristics can we use to assume what outputs might be a change output? This next part of the report, we talk about wallet fingerprinting, which is kind of another step that takes into account some additional information that's broadcast and included in a transaction. And what you can sort of do with this information is use it to apply it to the transaction graph and figure out when a new software is being used, basically.
Can I ask a quick question also?
Yeah.
Are you saying, because I know you just said no, that you've seen some similarities in the I just want to get it right, on the right side of the chart, of the graph, with D and E. You're saying you've seen this before?
Yes,
exactly by that you've seen this type of pattern before, and you're thinking it's correlated. You just clarify.
Yeah. This pattern. If you spend enough time looking at the transaction graph, like I do, you'll start to see a standard set of patterns that just sort of emerge. The one on the left, the peel chain, being kind of the most common. It's just a simple payment. Another very common sort of transaction fingerprint that you'll see is exchange batch transactions. Wasabi obviously has a little bit of a unique kind of fingerprint. And what I mean by this is unique, and I think this is a specific entity, and we'll talk about it a little bit more a little bit later, is that this is a repeated pattern that is relatively unique. We don't see this very often, and we'll talk about it, again, a little bit later, but if I can just, kind of hint at it right now. What we're seeing is basically the same entity exiting Wasabi and entering, basically another entity. That individual sweeping of UTXOs, that's kind of a normal spending pattern. But in context of this report, they were always spent to a P2SH or a 3 Bitcoin address. And then if you go to E and zoom in a little bit, you'll see that those transactions on the right, they have a previous a transaction. They're consolidating many outputs from the previous transaction, which either means this is somebody that's just trying to consolidate UTXOs, or something else a little bit more suspicious is going on. And we'll talk about that just a little bit later, if that kind of satisfies you for now. Does that make sense? Start of journey?
Yeah, thank you very much for that, pal. Yeah.
Okay. Anybody else? All right, cool. I'll keep going then. So, to pick up sort of where we left off, we were talking about wallet fingerprinting. This is a little bit of additional information from a transaction that you can, apply to the transaction graph and sort of see when a new software is being used. Typical fingerprinting includes address type, like I said, batch spending versus simple spending, change output indexes, and the transaction version number and lock time. And what we sort of found after we had a look through the preliminary sort of inflows was here's sort of the unique fingerprints of basically all the wallets that we saw that were involved. And this is sort of the distilled kind of information that's in that's sort of buried in that transaction graph that you won't see unless you sort of click on each transaction and open it up. But we've sort of split out that transaction graph into a couple of entities. The stolen wallet, the chip mixer. There's an intermediary wallet, Wasabi, and a post Wasabi wallet. So we started to use this information to paint a better picture of sort of what software is involved and what's kind of being used. So if we continue on, we go to the next page. We start to talk about custodial tumblers, and for those of you that don't know, I sort of hinted on it at the beginning. A custodial tumbler is basically a coin swapping service. They are trying to give users a new set of coins with a different history from what they had previously had. And this was one of the first kind of Bitcoin techs, privacy techs, were these custodial swapping services. They can do whatever they want with the coins. It should be relatively difficult to track. It shouldn't leave much of a clear fingerprint on chain. There are a lot of things that a custodial tumbler can do that a coin join cannot do. But you have to trust them with your coins, and for whatever reason, most of the tumblers still don't have very good on-chain privacy, which we kind of will talk about a bit more. So to refresh everyone's memory, we've had about 470 Bitcoin go into ChipMixer, 530 into a different process, and so because of the way that custodial tumblers work, we have to we're sort of reduced to a volume and kind of timing analysis. And what we have to do is get a good handle on all of the ChipMixer transactions that are happening around the time of the inflows. Make some assumptions, test some hypotheses, and see if we can't come up with any sort of really noticeable patterns. And so that's what we did. We took we analyzed the chain, scanned the blockchain from basically early August to late November. You can see the and analyze the inflows and outflows from ChipMixer. This figure that I just plopped into the chat is what, figure 6, and this shows the major outflow spike, right around the time of the inflows. And that could just be a coincidence. It could be one of two things. It could be another entity that was waiting for these coins to come in and for incoming liquidity and waiting for these coins to come in so that they could then leave, or this is basically the same entity that we had seen on the way in. And so we kind of took this one step further and said, okay, this entity deposited 470 Bitcoin into the custodial tumbler. Do we expect them to get thousands of 0.01 outputs, or do we think that they're gonna have some of these larger outputs? And this is the distribution of ChipMixer outputs from that same sort of time frame from August through November, late November. And what we see, this is a log scale for those of you that don't quite notice that, but that the 8 Bitcoin, well, basically anything more than 5 Bitcoins is a pretty rare output size. If we make kind of a simple assumption, based on sort of what normal people do with their spending habits, we don't think that the entity is going to get a ton of less than 0.5 outputs. It's very likely that, this person that sent in a few hundred Bitcoin at a time is going to get some of these larger outputs. And that's where we sort of came up with our sort of first list. We said, okay, what outputs might be happening around kind of that time frame? How kind of rare are these larger outputs, and can we use those as sort of a starting point for the analysis? And that's kind of what we did. So if we keep moving on, we're kind of going to sort of circle back to that figure 4 transaction graph, which is this one, where the coins apparently are mixed via Wasabi. But I sort of talked about kind of there's this intermediary wallet that's in between Wasabi and the Peel chain, and this other wallet that's at exiting the Wasabi Peel chain.
Okay. Before going to the other wallet, can I ask a question about this ChipMixer? Okay, so going back a little bit, so here does ChipMixer have a fixed address for receiving inputs and putting outputs? Like, are they fixed addresses that you monitor them, or?
ChipMixer has a unique fingerprint. It has basically a coin join fingerprint. They produce transactions with multiple outputs for the same denomination, and there's only a few denominations that I don't want to say a few. There's a handful of denominations that they have that are outputs. 0.001. And it's basically a multiple of that, 2 times multiple of that, up to 8.192. So you can basically scan the chain and find all of these transactions, and then monitor sort of the next transaction after that, which would be kind of the exit. And just to circle back to figure 3, all of those deposits were to that 17VU address. That was a reused address that was only used for ChipMixer inputs.
Okay.
So we're sort of going to move on to the kind of Wasabi / other entity process.
Before going that, may I ask another quick question, maybe?
Yes.
So, there's this assumption of, I guess you're saying 20 to 30 mixed outputs tend to be manageable for most users. So, like, how accurate is this assumption here? Because the 20 to 30 number seems arbitrary to me. I mean, can you explain your maybe assumption going to that?
Yeah. This entity deposited. I have my calculator in front of me. What is it? 470 Bitcoin, right? And if you had the choice of dealing with outputs for 470 Bitcoin, you wouldn't get, 0.5s, right? It's very unlikely that you would want to manage 800 outputs, let's call it, right? If you had 0.5 or less, right? So, that assumption is basically just a starting point. Maybe they had somewhere between, 1 and 10, or 1 and 30 or 40. But it's just sort of a basic starting point, and we could have gone into further detail. We could have gone into the point where we said, okay, what are the how many large outputs were there per day from this time frame? And basically, what we kind of saw was that, in, let me see, table 2. We sort of made a first broad assumption. We said, okay, let's just start with the 8 Bitcoin or greater outputs, and see how many of them are. And there weren't very many. They basically accounted for almost all of the inflows and outflows from that day, and that was just to get us a starting list, so that we could work with after we analyzed kind of the next entity and what was going on after that.
Okay.
So yes, it is an assumption, right? It's, they're not going to want hundreds or thousands of outputs. They're probably going to want, and that assumption could be wrong, right? It is just that, an assumption. But it's just sort of a starting point to kind of take the analysis to the next step.
Yeah.
Okay, so, moving on to the next step, we talk, let's see, we'll start with Wasabi. The coins were partially mixed. And what we mean by that is that a significant portion exited the mixer as change. I think everybody here sort of knows that unmixed change is just kind of a consequence of these equal output coin joins. But, of the 530 coins that went in, approximately 200 left as unmixed change, right? And, this is not normal behavior, right? Something's wrong here. Somebody, is doing something that they basically shouldn't be doing. And to kind of take this one step further, we sort of mentioned at the bottom, several mixed UTXOs were paid to reused addresses as unmixed change and de-anonymize. And, what we mean by that is what can be found in these example addresses. Let me see if I can't get these here. Yeah, here they are. If you copy one of these addresses into a block explorer, what you'll see is that it received a change output and a mixed output. And that mixed output, was de-anonymized because it received the same, received a mixed output and an unmixed output. And what we were able to do is sort of piece some of these flows together to better understand, kind of that overall process. And when we talked about, something not quite right is going on here with this other entity, this is sort of the first step in getting that kind of figured out. So let me move on to figure 8, which sort of describes this process a bit further. Let me see. And in this figure, I've sort of reoriented the transaction graph from figure 4. The Peel chain is now on top. We see sort of this intermediate wallet at C, item C. There's a P2SH address, which was different from the Peel chain addresses, and which is not a Wasabi address, which sort of stuck out like a sore thumb. And a couple of these addresses, were involved in receiving inputs from Hydra, which is, one of the largest darknet markets, which kind of was our first clue about who this entity might be and who kind of might be involved here. And if we move on to item D from this figure, we talked about the kind of fingerprint of this, second entity. What I've done in D is highlight all of the outputs with the same previous transaction hash. This is, either a blatant consolidation of previous UTX. Well, I mean, that's what it is. It's consolidation of UTXOs. But the question that you would ask if you saw this is something like, why would you have split those UTXOs in the first place if you're just going to recombine them later? That's a very wasteful process. It makes this sort of larger transaction much more expensive. And so this, to me, was a potentially algorithmic process. Somebody was trying to make larger UTXOs smaller on purpose, and possibly an entity was moving through this this process and consuming a large amount of liquidity that basically had to have those previously split outputs reconsolidated quicker or in basically in an inappropriate manner. So combined with this kind of Hydra data and this item D data, we said, we're probably looking at another custodial tumbler here. And that's when we found Blender. Blender is, another custodial tumbler similar to Chipmixer that's got a fairly decent kind of Russian presence, and that's how we found it. We found their Telegram. We found some addresses that they had posted, and we were able to confirm that the fingerprint of those publicly displayed addresses was the same as what we were seeing in I guess figure 8. So we've identified Blender. We've got a handle on kind of the entities that are involved, and we basically repeated the process that we did for Chipmixer, but for Blender. We tried to get daily inflows and outflows, so that we could kind of get a handle on how much volume we're sort of seeing. And this process was much more convoluted than it kind of was with Chipmixer, right? With Chipmixer, that outflow spike was very obvious, and it occurred on basically the same day. But in this figure, we don't really see that spike. It's much more noisy, and this has to do with sort of how our algorithm was used to scan for Blender, and it had to also do with kind of how Wasabi was basically running interference for these UTXOs. We couldn't pick them up in our heuristic that we used. But so while this data isn't quite as clear as what we had with Chipmixer, it was the first step to coming up with a list of UTXOs from Blender, postmix UTXOs from Blender. And if you recall from earlier, we had a Chipmixer, set of transactions, a likely Chipmixer set of transactions, and now we've got a likely Blender transactions. And basically all we did was marry the lists. We said, this entity was making deposits into both mixers, both at basically the same time, right? And so we know that they were using both, so let's look for outputs that were basically in close proximity to both, and that's what we did. We applied a little bit of more information. We talked about fingerprinting before, and we kind of narrowed our list down further. And what we were able to do is basically come up with a pretty, what we would call a most likely list of UTXOs that are attributable to the original sort of Kucoin hack. This is based on, again, everything that we looked at: volume, timing, and kind of that wallet fingerprinting, and using both services. And so to just hopefully kind of wrap the rest of the report up a little bit quickly, one thing that's sort of missed in some of these transaction graphs is the quote unquote intermediary wallet. We mentioned it in figure 8, item C. I say intermediary wallet, I sort of point that out. If you pull up the transaction graph, from figure 8, you can kind of see what I'm talking about a little bit better. Let me drop that in the chat at least. But this is it was sort of curious behavior, and again, we had seen it before, but this is, we were thinking, there's, again, something going on here. Let's see if we can't come up with a couple hypotheses for who is responsible for this spending. And what we basically found was that we kind of see it as two ways. Either Blender was responsible for sort of that intermediary wallet, and they're using Wasabi to sort of obscure their amounts, and as basically a complex pre-splitting process to basically protect Blender. or there's a third-party entity that's abusing all of these services at the same time. So let's just keep sort of moving on, and we can hopefully wrap up shortly. So the next question becomes, after we have kind of our short list of post-mix UTXOs, where do the coins go? What do we know about where the coins are spent? And we kind of found two sort of typical patterns. Here's the first one, which is just a very long, obscure peel chain. And, again, if you can take the time later and surf through the transaction graph, what we've done here is basically said, this very large change output is very obviously the change output. And the payments are to random places in very small amounts with no real discernible pattern, which is not quite what you would expect. You would expect something more along the lines of, this next transaction graph, which is, a relatively large amount of volume kind of all going to the same place or similar places. And this transaction graph is kind of a continuation of the previous one. Lots of large outputs from kind of the same entities, from both mixers, chip mixer, blender. We found outputs from Hydra Market and some other kind of interesting patterns. And they all sort of wind up at the same kind of place. Bybit, I've got some Binance hinted at in here. You would expect to see kind of more of this based on the volumes that we have involved. But what we really saw was more of the previous transaction graph, just very long kind of obscure peel chains that go to nowhere, which kind of raises, some additional questions about, really what's kind of going on here. So if we can sort of wrap up kind of at like a very high level overview of what we kind of saw, what the whole process looked like. Here is kind of an abbreviated transaction graph that kind of reduced all of the information that we kind of found into sort of one. We've got the Kucoin hack, the inflows that go into the mixers. We've got the large outputs from both Blender and Chip Mixer that get combined. We see the large obscure peel chain sort of down at the bottom. And then we talk a little bit about those partial flows to Bybit and Binance. And what we also saw was some recycling of these long obscure peel chains back to sort of the top right of this diagram, and we just called this recurring source X, which has been a very large source of volume for both Blender and Wasabi. We did a quick check, 20,000 Bitcoin sourced from this entity went through this sort of Blender Wasabi process just in the last year. So it's something that we've seen. It's something that we saw in the previous DPRK report, and seeing it again, this time kind of added a little bit more context. And so just to sort of wrap things up, overall kind of these observations, they raise, more questions than we can kind of answer at the time. Are these large volumes related to Hydra Market? Is this kind of a white glove laundering or mixing service? Are we watching Blender basically abusing Wasabi to sort of protect themselves? We don't quite know, and it's sort of it's just something that we'll have to keep an eye on. So basically, to kind of wrap things up and hopefully move on, we basically used a volume and timing analysis to come up with a most likely post-mix UTXO list based on spending large volumes from both mixers. And that's kind of the deal. I'm seeing some questions. White glove mixing service. So white glove would be like a very specialized service. White glove usually refers to like the kind of waiting service that you get when you go to a very fancy restaurant, like a black tie event or something like that. VIP. Thank you, Ashlyn. VIP is the word that I'm looking for. There's a single entity that's running the coins through all of these mixers. Would be one of the possible conclusions. And so that's kind of the rest of the report. I guess we'll open up the questions.
So
Yeah.
you mean this white glove is providing liquidity for these mixers or something?
We don't. Okay, so we don't know. It
Okay.
could be one of two things, right? If you go back and you review the DPRK report, those two guys were responsible for laundering the coins for the Lazarus group. And what they could have been doing was, running multiple mixers at the same time, kind of like sort of what we see here, and keeping, a set amount of coins available in those mixers. And when, they receive coins into their sort of service, they release coins from what's already has been mixed. It's very possible that that's kind of what's happening here. But we don't know because we just don't have enough information.
Okay, thanks.
Mm-hmm. Anybody else?
I'll chip in. All right, Ergo. All right, everyone. Happy New Year. So you've tracked these blokes down. Who's supposed to be tracking them down? It's all based out of China, I suppose. But do you see any sign of anyone actually looking into it other than you?
So chain analysis is a client of the Kucoin exchange. They released we sort of glossed over this at the beginning of the report because I just sort of wanted to talk about the Bitcoin stuff. But what it looks like happened was they were able to recover most of the coins from this specific hack. That's a bad copy paste job. They recovered a lot of the shit coins from this hack, but there was sort of no mention of the Bitcoin. So the question becomes, who's supposed to be kind of enforcing this? Who's supposed to be keeping an eye out on this? And I think we're still very early days with a lot of this stuff. The regulators are relying on the chain analysis firms to sort of make up their own rules and come up with some sort of industry standard. But if I could kind of summarize, is that the authorities don't have the expertise to basically do what needs to be done. And so to kind of come full circle and say, well, what about this hack? What about these Chinese hackers and the Lazarus group and all of this stuff? And that's a little bit different from, basically your garden variety theft. I mean, those are state sanctioned entities, right? It's not, Joe Schmo hacker. It's somebody that's connected with the government and, has some kind of backing. And, who's going to go after those guys? Right? The answer is kind of nobody, right? They're behind, they're in North Korea, right? Or wherever they are. They're basically state sanctioned. So the answer is kind of nobody's going to go after these guys, I think.
Cheers.
That was a really good question. I have just an off topic, maybe. Well, it's not off topic. What was the point of you guys doing this? Was this to expose some of these mixers and their flaws, or was it to show how Samurai is better, or like what was the point of this exercise, or was it just something fun that you guys wanted to kind of do? I'm just curious.
Yeah, that's a good question, Coinio. So if we try to keep an eye on basically whatever that we can, and this is a relatively important thing that happens, right? An exchange has $30 million or 1,000 Bitcoin stolen, and it just sort of goes into the abyss to never be talked about again, right? If we're lucky, maybe chain analysis puts out their own sort of biased research on this, right? They conclude that the bad guys used all the mixers, and we really have to stop them from using these privacy wallets. And some of the chain analysis services did that. They made that conclusion, and they did not correctly identify Blender. And so kind of one of the big things that we try to do is we try to be kind of the chain analysis that basically for Bitcoiners, right? That isn't going to have that kind of state-backed bias, that anti-Bitcoin narrative, which many of these chain analysis firms do. And then to answer your next question, right? The next follow-up thing is, okay, these guys did this. We were able to track them pretty well. What can we learn from this? How can we kind of improve? And a lot of that goes into what's basically already been incorporated into Whirlpool. We did volume and timing here, right? This entire analysis was reliant on volume and timing for the most part. And the ways to beat volume and timing is to do smaller amounts, right? And to do it over a very long time frame. you're not going to, jam your coins through a custodial. You should be jamming your coins through a custodial tumbler, several hundred Bitcoin through a custodial tumbler in 2 or 3 days, right? It's got to be a longer spaced out time frame, and nobody's going to take that risk. They're not going to leave their coins in these custodial tumblers for that long because they're going to be worried that your coins might not get sent back to you. I know if somebody sent me 400 Bitcoin, I'd never send it back to them. So Whirlpool works to kind of mitigate a lot of this, right? It's non-custodial. You don't have to worry about Samurai walking off with your coins. There are liquidity requirements, right? Either 3 premixers or 2 premixers. There needs to be at least somebody else trying to enter the same mix as you. So that way you're not just sort of mixing with the same old recycled liquidity. And remixing is free, and you can do it for like as long as you want, right? And so if you had this volume of coins, you would need to mix them for an extremely long period of time. Let's just call it months for now. And very carefully spend them in small amounts on the way out if you didn't want to get caught. And so that's basically doable today with Whirlpool. And it was sort of like that from the beginning.
That's really cool. My next question is privacy on the horizon for Bitcoin? I'm just curious because I think trying to get the government to stay out of our business, because they got us at the centralized banking system, right, with our fiat and all that. They track us all the time, and I think that short of pulling the money out of my bank in cash dollars and fiat and spending it, we have no privacy. And I'm wondering, is the community at large working on bringing this privacy to Bitcoin? Because there's nothing to match the privacy of cash dollars, right? When you pull them out of the bank, no one knows where you spend them. And I'm kind of wondering, is that kind of going to cross over into the Bitcoin by allowing privacy on Bitcoin?
Short answer, will better on-chain privacy come to Bitcoin? Probably not. I think that if it was going to be considered, it would have been talked about, and done quite a while ago, or at least the narrative would have started quite a while ago that we need to push for better on-chain privacy, and the development would have started, shortly after that. I don't think we'll see, confidential transactions or kind of anything really much that will do much to move the needle for Bitcoin privacy, which is why kind of the app layer stuff that we have with like Samurai, and Whirlpool is basically the only option for Bitcoin privacy at the moment.
Okay, and a follow-up to that is, just because I'm very new to all this, can I buy $50 worth of Bitcoin from whatever, Kraken or Coinbase or whatever, and can I send it directly to the Whirlpool, let it sit there for days or a week or whatever, and then extract it to my Samurai wallet? Or does it has to go to the Samurai wallet, then Whirlpool, and then back to my Samurai wallet? You know what I mean? I'm just trying to figure out how to do the privacy stuff.
Yeah,
that's not very private. If
you don't have to do multiple hops. No. The flow is you receive the coins to your Samurai wallet, you hit the Whirlpool button, the coins mix, and then they go to your post-mix account. It's all within your Samurai wallet. So you never have to leave. Nobody ever takes custody. So that's kind of one of the benefits of Whirlpool, right? Is that you don't have to jump through hoops. One of the benefits of Samurai, if you just use Samurai, it sort of handles a lot of these kind of concerns.
That's really cool. I did not know that. I'm learning. And I do know now that I'll be buying from BISC as well to help with the privacy stuff too, right?
Very cool. Yeah, good idea. No KYC.
Hey, a quick question, Max here again. When you're looking at the hops between all these clusters, such as between Chipmixer and Wasabi and all that, did you get any clue as to the kind of wallets that these guys are using in terms of fingerprints? And that's kind of one question. And then the second question is obviously you're highlighting to all of us the kind of these pill chains, but was there any attempt on any of these to make the flows more ambiguous? I hesitate saying post-mix tool type stuff, but anything kind of like that with decoy outputs or anything like that, or was it all very readable?
So as far as which service or what software they might be using, I'd have to check, what sort of the common wallet fingerprints are. Laurent might know. I think that he has a better handle on some of that than I do. I really don't have an idea. But as far as post-mix spending goes, I'm not really sure. We still aren't quite sure what happened here. We've got our list of post-mix UTXOs. We've got the ones that are combined from both mixers, and we've got sort of this fingerprinting that we really could sort of work out, which was, the first spend from post-mix had the same fingerprint as the initial deposits. And then the second spend had a new fingerprint, so presumably, right, they withdrew the coins to the same wallet that they used for deposit, right? And then they got transferred to a new software, right? And I don't know what that software is. There was no sort of post-mix spending tools. It sort of was just either those very long peel chains or kind of, that one example that we had where, a decent amount of flows went towards Binance or Bybit. And this kind of leads you to sort of, kind of two conclusions or two further questions. And at least one of the ones that we kind of came to is that it's possible that the coins were almost immediately swapped or sold or sent to a different service right away out of post-mix. And that's kind of the end of the analysis, right? We might be able to spend some more time and look into, where the coins sort of go. But I have a feeling that, they were either sold or swapped almost immediately afterwards. And then a new entity takes hold and basically becomes, the new custodian or is responsible for distributing the coins, something like a money mule service or something like that, because it just really was just not much of a pattern there.
Can I jump in for
Sure.
a question? So yeah, I'm looking at the table 1 example of wallet fingerprinting, and I heard that, as far as I can understand, you're taking advantage of some of the fingerprints that you see here. But the question is, how unique are these fingerprints? Because can't two unrelated wallets have the similar or exactly the same fingerprint and therefore mess up with your assumptions also?
Yeah, that's obviously a risk, right? Or it's obviously a possibility that could ruin our assumptions, right? But when you combine sort of the transaction graph flows like we did with this fingerprinting, and you sort of can marry the two, it's sort of
I see.
it's kind of like an Occam's razor thing,
Yeah.
and that's basically kind of a good TLDR of most of these analyses, right? It's that the simplest assumption is probably the correct one, right? Okay, so I've got a single UTXO spend to a P2SH address. Wasabi is BEC32, and the previous one was P2PKH, and version number 2 and lock time has changed. All this stuff sort of changes. You kind of comes into line, and you say, okay, there's probably something in between here, right? And you're not using this as sort of like a dragnet style thing, because that's exactly how you would get into trouble. How exactly it would ruin your assumptions and ruin your ruin your analysis. And I think that chain analysis may at some point start to suffer from that, hopefully sooner rather than later, where they get to the point where they're not doing enough targeted, kind of like we have. They don't really understand quite what's going on at the very kind of granular level. Hopefully that comes at some point and we can have a debate on that. I think that would be very beneficial to the Bitcoin community if we could, just sort of further prove them, kind of wrong. But yes, to answer your question in a long roundabout way, yes, your assumptions can get screwed if you're really just applying them completely out of context. Yeah.
Okay, I understand. So you use these assumptions not by themselves, but in support of other also observations on the chain.
Correct.
Okay, thanks.
Here's a question.
Oh, you beat me to it.
Oh yeah. Okay, so had those funds been processed through Samurai, would you have been able to do an analysis as thorough and detailed as you did this one?
I talked about it a little bit before when Coinio asked, right? The question becomes, okay, what do you do if you're dealing with this kind of amount of funds? Like what kind of options do you have? One of the long-standing assumptions was that, the custodial tumblers were doing much more volume than, any of the CoinJoin software. So one of the things that sort of gets buried in this report is how much volume are these mixers really doing? Typical outflows for chip mixer, average for our 3-month time frame, 85 Bitcoin a day. The same for Blender, 115 Bitcoin a day, roughly the same amount. And that's certainly higher than Whirlpool at this point, right? It's maybe a little bit less true. Wasabi tends to have larger just volume in general, but some of that's recycled or not really enforced volume. So the question becomes, okay, is Whirlpool really the best option for this? And it's going to be difficult to mix this volume of funds for anyone using any software, kind of just sort of the way things are right now, just basically on Bitcoin overall. But like I said, this entire analysis was for the most part reliant on volume and timing, and to somewhat of a lesser extent fingerprinting, combining the use of both services to come up with this kind of analysis. So we've got a lot of unique pieces of information that we can sort of marry together and come up with sort of another Occam's razor most likely scenario. Now, if you dump this volume into let's say the 0.5 pool and you let it mix for 24 hours and you pulled it out, like it would still be obvious, right? But again, what you can do with Whirlpool that you can't do with the custodial CoinJoins is you can put the coins in there and you can let them mix for as long as you want, and you can spend them in small amounts, kind of as you would like, right? So would it still have been enough to stop somebody from dumping, 200 Bitcoin in and pulling it out pretty quickly? Would that still be enough? Would Whirlpool still be enough? The answer is probably not right at this point. You're still going to have to break up that volume and that timing, but at least you can do it with Whirlpool in a non-custodial way, right? So you're sort of incentivized to do smaller, to spend smaller amounts on the way out and remix for as long as possible, which, handles a lot of the things that we relied on in this report, if that makes sense.
Thank you.
Yeah, Argo, on the 22nd page of the PDF, you say that roughly 200 Bitcoins were unmixed changed from Wasabi wallet. Am I getting this right?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, so isn't this horribly inefficient mixing? Because if I have 500 odd Bitcoins and I'm using a mixer, then I would like to have as much Bitcoins as possible to be mixed, not being unmixed change. What do you say here? Am I getting this wrong? Like this doesn't make any sense if I have 200 unmixed coins.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. It's you pay for the mix up front in Whirlpool, and your coins are mixed, and that's basically it, right? But with Wasabi, it is pay as you go, and I'm still not sure. I have a couple of hypotheses here, but again, this is just sort of spitballing. They have some sort of a headless daemon, that I think just basically can be sort of halfway programmed to halfway do the right thing. And it's possible that, whatever entity is doing this is sort of abusing that, right? And, Turk raises a good point, which is like, I want all of my coins mixed because I want, my privacy. And why isn't this entity doing that, right? And that kind of comes full circle to, it's possible, right? One of the highest possibilities that Blender is simply using Wasabi as sort of a fancy splitting or fancy peeling front that will obfuscate some of their their own volume, pre-split it a little bit. Maybe we don't mix it all the way, but we don't really care because it's going into the second mixer anyway. That would be kind of one of the simplest explanations for what's going on here. It's just that.
Yeah, that makes sense given the assumptions and the observation. Yeah.
Well, good to finally hear your voice and connect with you. It's been a while. Just more generally, I'm curious if you guys have any commercial licenses to any platforms, any other chain analysis platforms, and if you poke around in them.
No, we don't. They are very expensive and, riddled with non-disclosure agreements and all other kinds of information that, basically keeps us shut out. I mean, something like $30,000 a year, for access to one of these platforms. And you sort of have, raised the question, well, what information do they really kind of get that we don't get, with OXT? Because they're sort of paired with the exchanges, they will, obviously get the exchange data. They get the exchange labeling, the exchange cluster. Here's our exchange, here's all of our addresses, Mr. Chain Analyst, kind of thing. We don't get that, right? We have to go out and sort of manually try to find a lot of that. And that really is, one of the only things that we kind of don't have that they have. They also do some kooky shit like IP address tracking, which is like really spooky. But other than that, we aren't too far behind them, except for really the labeling. So yeah, we don't poke around with any of that. I wouldn't want to be seen, paying them in any respect.
Absolutely. I'd hope you'd just find a way to get in there without paying for it and just steal whatever you can. So you're working exclusively on oxt.me? You work on the web platform yourself and KYCP?
I don't. Well, that's what I use. I'm not one of the developers of either of those platforms. That's Laurent. Laurent does most of the OXT work. OXT was his baby. I think, one of these days I'd like to get, him on for a chat, but, he does most of the dev work. I do a lot of the heavy lifting, the entity tagging, I do the tracking like we did here. Yeah, that's kind of the deal.
All right, that's what I meant. You're using these tools as your analysis platform. There isn't like a proprietary version or something more specialized that you have. It's the same thing that I can whip up on my browser here.
Yeah, 100%. Absolutely.
Oh, very cool.
And it's one of the reasons that I wanted to spend some time going over the transaction graph with you guys, and I was happy to get a couple questions with, hey, what's really going on here? I know it seems like a little bit daunting at first, especially without any kind of context. It's you open up a transaction graph and it's like really hard to read with no context. People have been scared away from, sort of doing their own chain analysis, right? You can't put your transaction ID into the Block Explorer because, now you've told the Block Explorer that, you sent, $10 to so-and-so, or so-and-so sent you $10. And, that's such a damn shame, because if it wasn't for kind of that context, if you don't have any of that context, it's really hard to get started with doing sort of your own, bottoms up learning, so I encourage people to check, whatever payments that they get, plop them into OXT and see if you can't figure out where, those coins came from. How did your friend get them, or so-and-so get them? And you probably wouldn't be too surprised. You're only 1 or 2 hops from a KYC exchange, and it's not that, and plopping the, that transaction ID into OXT is, absolutely the least of your worries. But I think we have some other stuff coming up about, I think tours planned for OXT. We've got a real-time update coming and a couple other things that should, kind of help placate some of that. But let me see. Anybody else? Any other questions?
Yeah. What's up, Ergo?
Hey, MJ.
What would you have done differently? Like, what's best practice for mixing this volume of coin?
Best practice? Is this bait?
Like, well, because like 1,000 Bitcoin into a whirlpool. Let's say you want it as quick as possible. You don't want to wait months and do it slowly, a little bit at a time.
Surprisingly, somebody would say something like, well, you should just make a very small deposit into OXT, or into Whirlpool, 10 Bitcoin at a time or whatever. What you need to do is you need to get all of your coins mixing as soon as possible. The sooner you get them mixing, the sooner you start building that kind of anonymity. So this would be a little bit counterintuitive. It would be, get the coins in kind of as quickly as you can, right? Basically, I mean, it doesn't matter whether you do it, small amounts over a long period of time or kind of all in one go. But really, it's the withdrawing then that matters, right? Once you get your coins mixing, take them out in very small amounts. Don't be sending them to the same destination. Don't be sending them in the same uniforms amounts. So it would basically be something like, let them mix for a month. If you had to boil it down to sort of one thing, let them mix for a month or two, something like that. And even then, that might not be enough. I'd have to go back and look at really sort of like, what volumes is a 0.5 pool do? Is 2 months enough? Does it need to be 3? Something like that. But you just need to let your coins mix for a really long time. And when you go to spend, you got to spend small amounts. That's exactly, those are the two biggest things I would say.
Right, but say you didn't have time and you wanted to spend it all as soon as possible.
I would say have fun in jail.
All right. Fair enough.
So, I mean, just another question about this privacy, Bitcoin, and the whole idea. I mean, I guess you could say if you do it right, there's a lot more privacy in Bitcoin than there is in your central bank account, right? They can track you, everything you spend your money on, credit cards, so on. But I mean, is there anything legislatively or law-wise that's coming for Bitcoin or just privacy in general? Because the more that I study this and learn, it's actually really scary to see that they can, one, shut your bank account down, two, if they know that this wallet you bought Bitcoin at this wallet and it's sitting in this ledger or some other place, they can just come and take it or arrest you or whatever. And I'm wondering, like, is there any way we're ever going to fight back against that? Is there anyone on our side legislatively or anything? Is there anything else that we can do?
I think that sort of the cypherpunk ethos would be something like, yeah, we have to build the tools to route around them. Is that we can't rely on legislators to have our back because they probably don't. Most people have their own interests, kind of in mind. We've seen some cookie legislation coming out recently about, self-hosted, self-custody, what's going to be kind of involved around all of that. And there are lobbyists already for, the Bitcoin banks, I would just call them. There are already, exchange lobbyists that, they don't have your best interests at mind. They have their own best interests at mind. So I wouldn't hope or hold out for any legislation. The way I kind of see it is that you can either be maximally compliant, right? And you can use Bitcoin as a compliant stock, right? Where I just, maybe if I'm lucky enough to withdraw to my own self-custody wallet, maybe I get to do that and then I can send it to an exchange later. Or you have to plan to be kind of non-compliant, right? And, non-compliance is kind of what, Whirlpool and CoinJoin and privacy is all about, sort of giving you the tools to, really exit and opt out, for lack of a better term. That kind of got co-opted, but it was at one point a good phrase to opt out.
Okay, if I can hop in, I would like to ask one more thing.
Sure.
So at the one of the figures I see, as you have shown in the PDF, there's a huge consolidation transaction. It's called I'm kind of zoomed in on the PDF, so I can't see the page or the table figure number. But so seeing this large consolidation transaction is actually making me cringe. Okay, so why are hackers? Why are hackers seemingly unaware of good transaction privacy practices?
So I think what we're seeing here is Blender's algorithm at work. And what this transaction graph is showing is something that, you wouldn't pick up if you just looked at, a single transaction in isolation. This is what kind of becomes available to you when you look at the transaction graph in general. It's like, I don't know if a better way to explain it, but something along the lines of, the human eye can see when there's bullshit going on, and this is clearly bullshit, right? There's some entity consuming a ton of liquidity and sucking, whatever fragmented UTXOs that the Blender algorithm had previously split up into the same transaction so that they can withdraw their 20 BTC UTXO, right? And what this shows basically is that is too much volume for this mixer. A 20 BTC withdrawal, whatever the withdrawal from this transaction is too much, and you can see it pretty clearly here. It's really hard to kind of convey this to somebody else, which is sort of why we write the report and we go through all the steps. We test the hypotheses. We say, how could this be wrong? But you can kind of see it plain as day. The human eye can see this bullshit, clear as day. And I think that most of the tumblers, most of the algorithms, they're not doing this level of research. They didn't come to Bitcoin from that sort of, for lack of a better term, entropy kind of first principles. But Whirlpool and the Samurai team did. And when you look at the difference between, a Whirlpool CoinJoin and this, you go, okay, Whirlpool looks random. This looks like something, right? It's kind of what you come out with.
Okay.
if I could just speak for a second. First, I want to say thank you for spending your time and answering all our questions, because this is some really interesting shit. Like, this is this is blowing my mind out of the water. I know you talked quickly about the cookies and IP addresses, and that how that could possibly be a connection to someone. Do you have anything more to say on that? Because I think that's a real big part of this whole privacy thing, because, you know, you could use a Samurai wallet and do all these other things, but then if someone wanted to look into you and they could see your IP address, that's, you know, it's game over, really. So I don't know if you have anything more to say on that, such as, is that actually going to be a big problem? Can you see governments and, you know, authorities using that? And also, have you noticed a trend in the government and authorities actually looking to do this type of analysis for, you know, blockchains and cryptocurrencies, or are they still miles behind?
Good question. Start of the journey. I'm happy to see that you're so stoked on this stuff. I know it's complicated, and you know you're asking kind of the right questions. As far as kind of the IP address stuff goes, you know what we sort of know is just what sort of chain analysis, and I just use chain analysis kind of as the broad term for surveillance firms. If I don't say specifically surveillance firms, that's really kind of what I'm talking about.
Right.
Is that they've started incorporating IP addresses into their analysis. They'll say, you know, such and such IP address broadcast this transaction, and that IP address is located in, I don't know, Russia, right? Something like that. Or it's, you know, we saw it even with the Twitter hack, you know. This very large transaction that went to the scammers, the Twitter scammers, was from a Japanese wallet, you know, and they'll just make sort of like a very broad kind of, you know, comment like that. You know, they won't say associated with such and such, you know, node at your house, right? They aren't going to that level, but they will sometimes, you know, put the IP address, or they will say kind of which country. And this kind of, you know, it could be used for two things, right? If your node is broadcasting everything over ClearNet, well, you know, that's not good, right? That sort of answers your, well, what about your IP address, right? The other thing that I think they're sort of looking to do with that is say, well, which exchanges did this come from? You know, maybe a lot of exchanges aren't using Tor when they broadcast their transactions. You know, they don't give a shit, right? They're an exchange. So they can kind of get an idea, you know, which exchange did, you know, such and such thing. And I think that that's part of the other, the other kind of part of it. And if you kind of even take it sort of full circle, you say, okay, this was broadcast by this, you know, node, this IP address, which is in this country. It's kind of like what we did with our analysis. How do we identify Blender? Well, Hydra is a Russian darknet market, and you know, if Hydra is involved in whatever this mixing process is, it's very likely that other Russians are using this kind of mixing service. Maybe they sort of use it kind of similarly to that. You know, it's just sort of another piece of the pie that might lead them somewhere. Right. I don't think that they're quite targeting individual users yet. I mean, they might, right? And that's always a risk. So, you know, use Tor to broadcast your transactions, right? Is I guess the conclusion there.
Do you mean by using Tor to broadcast your transactions, as in logging into the wallets and the exchanges through Tor? Is that what you mean?
Well, a lot of the node stuff is implemented. It's implemented basically at the node layer, and the IP address stuff that whatever chain analysis firms can get is just sort of what information that's there, right? So if you're broadcasting on ClearNet, you know, you might leak your IP address, quote unquote, you might leak your IP address. But if you're using Tor, you know, sort of at the kind of the Bitcoin D level to broadcast your transactions, it's a little less of a concern. This is kind of what I'm getting at. And somebody will correct me about how that might be wrong, but I think it's sort of along those lines.
Right. Okay. I see. I understand. Right. Yeah. That. This is something that people actually don't know. So when, you know, obviously a lot of people get into the, you know, Bitcoin and cryptocurrency space, and you know they might hear Bitcoin's private, then they might learn further on this, you know, pesto anonymous, if that's the correct way to say it. But you know, I think we've all learned that, you know, governments and shit can't really be trusted, and we're all here to bypass them. You know, we're not like some of these centralized exchanges are pretty much crypto banks. They're just banks, you know. But in the crypto world, you know, like you just said, no, you should assume that if the exchange knows your IP, these chain analysis firms are also going to know your IP. And if they do catch up, especially these governments and, you know, these authorities, if they do catch up, they've pretty much got a full table of data ready for them, if I'm kind of thinking of it correctly. But yeah, no, that's very interesting on the Samurai side.
How do we purchase Bitcoin and not have a footprint? Like for me right now, I mean, I only have one on ramp, right? It's my credit card or my debit card, or something like that from a centralized bank. I don't have a secret way to actually acquire Bitcoin. How do I start at the very beginning to avoid all of that?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I can only speak for sort of my experience, right? I didn't I didn't come to Bitcoin like, as a programmer, hardcore cypherpunk. I came in kind of like everybody else does. You come in, number go up, gold bug, libertarian stuff, and then you sort of say, wait a minute, this is pretty fucked, and what do I do? How do I get back, all the shit that I did wrong? And, people are going to hate this, but, a lot of it has to do with how you first sort of learn about it, how you first kind of come to Bitcoin. The thing that you can do, right, now that you sort of know better, is talk to the people that you know as you introduce them to Bitcoin, right? You're not going to you shouldn't be introducing it to them as sort of like a compliant stock, right? If you sort of take it as, look, this is dissonant money, this is black market money, a lot of people, they'll get it pretty quickly. I think it's a bigger problem that nobody talks about, that, is that if it's really not hard you don't have to frame it for people that way. They just sort of get it. They're now, looking at the world and how it's totally gone to shit. And they'll say, yeah, this makes sense. I understand why you would do this. And if you come to it from that perspective, then you don't make all the mistakes in the first place, right? You're not going to be perfect. You still need, some hand holding. You're not technical. You don't know about Whirlpool. You don't know about BISC. But that's why it kind of comes back to, like, when you teach the people that you care about most about Bitcoin, you shouldn't be go to Coinbase, right? Or just use Cash App. You just got to get as much of this shit as you can before it's too late. It's like, wait a minute, let's take a step back and sort of do this the right way.
So regarding the Blender analysis, so you talk about this graph traversal heuristic. As you say, you used output footprints for the first mixer, the chip mixer, right? So we know that I think you're observing large amounts of 0.001 BTC outputs going around on the chain to identify this chip mixer. Can you talk about the graph traversal heuristic that you use to identify Blender?
Yeah. So Blender doesn't have that distinct sort of like CoinJoin output footprint with those unique 0.001 or 0.002, multiple outputs that are very similar to that CoinJoin footprint. What Blender looks like it's more doing is a complicated kind of splitting or very dispersed kind of, peeling algorithm or sort of cluster. If I could try to explain it, a little bit visually. The coins come in. If they're a large volume of coins, they get split up into much smaller amounts, so that, when somebody later goes to withdraw, it sort of is a little bit more dispersed. And this is basically Laurent's idea. All the credit goes to Laurent, which it was very clever. Is that, okay? He sort of identified that sort of peeling deterministic nature of their kind of algorithmic process. And what he basically did was he said, okay, we've got the address type, we've got the transaction, fingerprint, the version number, the lock time, and there's basically no address reuse there as well. And so what he basically did was we started with a handful of quote unquote seed transactions, and like item D from, I think it was figure 8 would be an example of that. You start from that and you follow the transaction graph forwards and backwards, and you stop it when you get to a wallet with a different fingerprint, that doesn't match all of your kind of criteria. So that would be if you get to a transaction that includes, a PKH output instead of a P2SH output, a different version number, or there's address reuse, because that's sort of what we've seen with Blender, is that it doesn't have any of those kinds of traits. You sort of use that as kind of the bounds to your analysis, and you expand the analysis forwards and backwards. Does that make sense?
Okay, so as far as I understand, so you send in an UTXO for the Blender, and then you look to what's coming out to you, and then you go backwards, sort of traversing the blockchain transactions. Is it like this?
It's pretty much like that. I don't think that we quite did it in that order. I'd have to go back and look at our notes and see which we did first. But I sort of halfway identified Blender thanks to some public social posts on social media. We looked at dozens of these transactions, similar to item D from Figure 8, right, or item E from Figure 8, and said, okay, this is that pattern. And before you even really identify Blender, you don't even need to sort of know that it is Blender. You just sort of know that this is a very consistent pattern. It's very unique. It's very likely to be the same entity on chain. So you don't even need a name at that time. You just sort of say, let's just bound this specific behavior on chain by any other behavior that doesn't match these criteria.
Okay, thank you.
If no one's got anything else to say, I'd like to ask, do you know you also done, I'm not sure how long ago it was, the plus token analysis, which was actually really interesting, which is the first one I read from OXT. Because I can't actually remember I know it's a little like off topic from this analysis, but what was your conclusion there on where did they use the kind of similar process to this, like this kind of entity or entities do it completely different? I know it's a bit of a
no. This is a good question. So for those of you that don't know, I'm probably best known for being the plus token guy, which was the multi-billion-dollar Ponzi scheme that kind of really got going in 2019, and it sort of became kind of the story of the end of the bear market. Oh, plus token is dumping all the coins. They captured 200,000 Bitcoin roughly, right? And then proceeded to slowly filter those coins back to exchanges, presumably to be sold. And this, when I first noticed plus token, was when I was sort of doing that do your own research phase, and do I want to use Wasabi or do I want to use Whirlpool? And everybody's talking about which one's better, and there's both sides, and let's take a look at this on-chain stuff. And that was when I just stumbled on basically a ton of address reuse present in the Wasabi coin join process at the time. And it's sort of like this analysis. It was basically predominantly a volume and timing analysis, but with the added detriment of the address reuse. And what I didn't notice, at least at the time, unfortunately, I wish I kind of had, let me find the message, was this. I'm going to reply to this now. This message where change outputs were being paid to mixed outputs. I really wish I had noticed that earlier on, because this has been a risk ever since address reuse was introduced to Wasabi, whenever that was, inadvertently or for whatever means. It's just there, and it's something that just can't be ignored. So to sort of answer your question kind of long way about plus token and what kind of happened there, it was a very similar volume and timing analysis, at least in regards to Wasabi, with the added detriment of address reuse. And the other thing that we sort of those coins almost went exactly to exchanges as well, which was very, very evident. It's especially as I sort of got a handle on it. And the one other thing that I sort of mentioned in sort of one of the first things that I wrote about plus token was the self-shuffling process. This is besides kind of Wasabi, right? This was their own sort of homebrewed kind of mixer, custodial. Well, I shouldn't say custodial. This was their own sort of homebrewed kind of process. And I just pasted an image of this into the chat. And all the way on the left side, there's a single transaction that split a few thousand Bitcoin into a few hundred it was probably 100 or 200 UTXOs, for 10 Bitcoin or so each UTXO. There's sort of a one hop in the transaction graph here, and then you can sort of see this first self shuffle where all of the outputs that were from the previous transaction get combined into the same transaction, and the process basically just sort of repeats on and on. And what you can sort of see from this overall system is that there's no incoming liquidity as a part of this process. And that's kind of how I came to this is self-shuffling. This is a single entity doing their own thing with no other new incoming liquidity. It's all from all the way from the left side of the transaction graph. These are all the same coins. So to kind of get back to one of the big important things that Whirlpool does that none of the other CoinJoin or basically custodial tumblers even really enforce very much, is that need for incoming liquidity, and that really sets kind of Whirlpool apart from the others. Is that if you sort of try to run the same transaction graph, you would see coins coming in from new TX zeros for each mix, and you go, oh wait, this is getting harder and harder for me to kind of continue on with this process. So hopefully that answers your question in sort of a more of a roundabout way. But how was that startup journey? You got anything else?
Yeah, no, that's interesting. That's fine. Yeah, as you can see by the what you just pointed out, it all started on the left-hand side. There was actually no incoming liquidity, like of a, basically add into it, and yeah, self-shuffling, basically just all the way to the end where it's just fucking like madness.
The process would continue until you would hit the exit transaction, which is like also extremely obvious. It's like, which is another heuristic that we probably should talk about. It would be like, a few hundred, inputs, 100 inputs anywhere from 4 to, 8 BTC, and all with a single output. A single output transaction is very likely to be basically a self-transfer or sending all coins to an exchange or something like that. It's either a self-transfer or you're sending it to a service where you don't need to worry about making an actual payment because there's no change. And that was evident on the way out of this process as well.
Right. Okay. And just so I'm understanding the different terminology, a CoinJoin and a tumbler, just because for some reason I actually don't know the difference. What is the difference?
Well, thank you for asking. And I know I get shit for this, and we get shit for this all the time, is blurring the lines because it's a pain in the ass to say tumbler versus CoinJoin. We just say mix, right? Pre-mix,
right.
Like referring to Samurai, pre-mix, post-mix, whatever. And mix kind of got blurred into like chip mixer. Mix is in the name, right? And some of these, Bitcoin mixer, a lot of these custodial tumblers, they have mixer in the name. So the lines have been blurred, but the biggest distinctions are a custodial tumbler is just that. They take possession of the coins. We don't know their algorithm because they're doing whatever it is that they're doing, and they're not kind of open source, sort of like CoinJoin is. And a CoinJoin, on the other hand, is completely non-custodial. You always retain possession of the coins, and instead of sort of going into some shared sort of cluster, shared database in the custodial tumbler, a CoinJoin looks to break the merged input heuristic by returning identical outputs, to the same user in the same transaction. This takes the transaction graph from deterministic to probabilistic. You're introducing, uncertainty at the transaction graph level. Whereas sort of a custodial tumbler, it still does introduce uncertainty at kind of the transaction graph level, but it does it in a custodial manner because it's operating a shared wallet.
Surprisingly, that makes pretty much perfect sense. Yeah.
Okay, good. I'm glad I nailed that one.
I didn't want to come back and go, could you explain again? No, yeah, that makes perfect sense. CoinJoin basically open source, kind of Whirlpool, if that's correct. And then custodial, it's in the name custodial tumbler. They've taken possession basically, like you're trusting them, just like a centralized exchange. This and that and a few other things. Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you very much for explaining that to me.
Hello, everyone. Can I ask a question as well?
Hey.
So this report was about Kucoin hack, right? So and as far as I can understand from the report, all coins except Bitcoins got recovered. Am I right with that?
We don't know. All that he said was something like 84% of the coins were recovered.
Okay.
Based on the timing, I don't think that they recovered the Bitcoin when he issued that statement, right? Just based on when the mixing started, when the coin started coming out the other side. I think that probably what happened was Chain Analysis said something along the lines of, look, you guys are shit out of luck for this other, 1,000 Bitcoin, but we got you 80% of what's left. And, so they took a victory lap and they hung their hat up. I'm actually hopeful, we might see something in the next coming days, right? Chain Analysis usually puts out some sort of year in review marketing brochure where they pester you with or pellet you with a ton of graphs with no context, right? It's like imagine reading an OXT report without any real words that describe what's going on. It's like totally basically meaningless, just data manipulation that just gets sort of thrown into a marketing brochure. I expect that they'll say something about Kucoin. I don't think that they cannot say anything about Kucoin. So I'm excited to see what comes out of that. I don't think that they'll acknowledge us. They did acknowledge us for Plus Token after the fact, but I think that was only because some of the investment community sort of gave them a hard time. I got a lot of questions from the trader types about Plus Token, and I think they got shit from them for not getting it right. And so they gave us a little bit of acknowledgement after the fact. So we'll see what happens with Kucoin.
That's good to hear.
We've done a shit hot job, mate. So, you deserve the praise for it. I didn't see anything else close to that kind of.
Yeah, and another thing I would like to ask is this. I mean, as you alluded more than once, you're saying these are all just timing and volume plays, timing and volume analysis, and as we are doing now, as these reports and these Q&As go more and more public, do you think hackers will or stealers, whatever, will get understand that what they're doing is not enough and move to something else, some other strategy for their coins or something?
I would hope so. I would hope that, somebody would say, look, hey, something is going, whatever we're doing right now isn't working, and, let's fix this shit. I think that there's a couple different things going on as well. We talked about sort of the DPRK guys and how they're basically state sanctioned. They don't really care, if they get caught because they're living in China. It doesn't matter, right? Yeah. But for sort of like your garden variety, idiot that's scalping, ledger data, ledger phishing, and sending 77 Bitcoin straight to OKX. You'd hope that at some point maybe that guy says, hey, we should stop doing whatever it is that we're doing. But I will say this. I think that there was a little bit of a change in behavior here, at least in this report. Something that's pretty subtle that doesn't sort of get noticed is that, again, the purpose of the custodial tumblers is that they're supposed to act as a swap service, right? You put your UTXOs in and you're hopefully getting somebody else's back. And what we saw with ChipMixer was that as soon as the entity involved started getting their own coins in return, they stopped using ChipMixer, right? So it's possible that these guys in this particular scenario are a little more savvy and they're kind of dialed into what's going on, and they're saying, wait a minute, this is fucked up, we got to use something else instead. And that's when they moved on to Blender.
Oh, you say in between the operation, while the operation was going, they say, "Oh my God, like this chip mixer is busted. We are seeing these reports coming out. Let's change the mixers." Do you think they did that, or?
No. I mean, if you put a gun to my head and said, "Tell me who is doing this," I would say the only closest other entity that we have is the China DPRK report. Those two guys. If you said you must pick somebody who initiated this, I would say it's them. And they were already using ChipMixer. They're already sort of halfway involved with this Blender kind of wasabi thing that's going on. So they were already sort of doing that, but it's sort of subtle. And let me just find the page in the report. We say something like, all of their deposits went to a single address, right, into ChipMixer. If you look at, our sort of post-mix UTXO list, we'll say, which coins, if they got basically the same coins that they deposited in return, right? So the point is to act as a swap service. If you're not getting somebody else's UTXOs, then why the hell am I using the service? And what we found was on the 28th, right, the last day that they were using ChipMixer, they started getting their own coins back in return, and that's when they stopped using ChipMixer.
Yeah,
Right.
no, now that makes sense. They see that their method isn't working. They're getting the same coins they put into the mixer, and they say, "Oh, that's not working," and change.
Absolutely. Yep. 100%. So I think that happened here. I think that's what they did. So that's a step in the right direction, at least.
I see. I see. So the hackers are getting more sophisticated in the sense that they are observing their own actions. You know, they're not just blindly trusting the mixer, but they're also observing their own coins. You know?
Yes. Yep. And that might not be necessary for anybody who's sending in, 1 Bitcoin at a time or doing whatever it is that they're doing, right? But I mean, in this case, they sent in 400 Bitcoin over 3 days, and it's like, you might need to be concerned. And that was one of the other things that, and I mentioned it earlier, was, the meme was Chip, all these custodial tumblers are doing tons and tons of volume. So one of the things that I really enjoyed about this report was saying, well, how much volume are they really doing every day? We don't highlight it in the report. That could be sort of its own topic, is just dissecting the custodial tumblers. But, in the context of this overall thing, that sort of gets lost. But anyway, I mentioned, 85 Bitcoin a day roughly for the average for Chip Mixer, and 115 or so for Blender, with Blender having that boosted sort of, single entity that keeps coming back. But so hopefully these entities are getting a little more complex, and they're sort of realizing, hey, Bitcoin isn't perfect, right? It's not.
Yeah.
But and again, to sort of circle all the way back, right? These guys are probably state sanctioned, right? They don't have the same threat model as you and me, or the ledger fisher guy, right?
Yeah, definitely.
You've been softballed long enough. It's time for some hard questions.
Yeah.
No, in all seriousness, that was great job on the report. Now, obviously, this stuff doesn't get done because we're trying to help law enforcement or show change surveillance, the stuff that they're missing. This stuff at the end of the day is done so that we can now look at it and say, okay, they screwed up at X, Y, and Z, so let me not do X, Y, and Z. So I want perfect privacy. Since I want perfect privacy, I would like Ergo to tell me what is one single thing that you would say is you would put at the top of the list if I want to stay out of trouble. Would it be like attribution, that first initial fingerprint, being able to put on your address? What would be the one thing that you would say to a starting point?
That's a really good question. We wrote a Twitter hack report that just sort of got buried amongst other things at the time. And, what I tried to come up with for that was something along the lines of, some negative advice, things that like you absolutely should not sort of do. And if you do these things kind of in conjunction, you're going to be okay, right? I know a lot of people, we hear like, don't, do this or do that, or use this tool, use this other software, and it sort of just gets kind of muddied. I actually, accidentally have the list kind of here in front of me. Probably the first thing that I would say is, don't associate yourself or your online identity with kind of, your Bitcoin addresses, right? And that gets back to sort of this no KYC kind of thing. That's a big no-no. So, keep your addresses and your identity separate. Don't post your addresses. Use your paynims instead. Right after that would be do not reuse addresses. Then you don't have to rely on the common input ownership heuristic. You just know it's the same entity. Do not combine, sort of your UTXOs from different sources. We talk about that in the chat all the time. It's like, hey, I've got this change from source A and source B. Can I combine them so I can re-enter Whirlpool? And it's, would you be comfortable with those entities knowing that you control those, those coins? And so the good example would be, I have a KYC source and a non-KYC source. Should I combine them into, sending them into Whirlpool? The question would be, would you be comfortable with your KYC source knowing that you are using non-KYC Bitcoin? And I think the answer to that is no. So keep those kind of separate. And then kind of the one of the last things is, don't spend without establishing sort of your forward secrecy.
So no KYC only, just use Samurai, perfect privacy. Gotcha. Thank you.
Yeah, 100% privacy, 100% perfect.
I agree.
Okay. Kind of as the last question I would like to ask from the report on the page 16, it's about the chip mixer. It says chip denominations are even multiples of 0.001 and range up to 8.192. That's an odd number. What's behind this? Like, why do you think this is some 8.192 and not 10? Or
That's a multiple of 2. That's binary.
Yeah, it's a binary
that's
thing.
also true, but not up. Why up to 8.192?
Well, probably 8.192 was a reasonable spending amount. Well, I shouldn't say reasonable. It was
Yeah.
probably a relatively high amount, even whenever Chip Mixer was started. Let's just call it 2013, 2014. Let's call it, $8,000, just for argument's sake.
Yeah.
Right. And now today it's like some astronomically high amount that really probably needs to be discontinued. And I think, I'm going to put words in the Chip Mixer devs mouth, but he probably thought something along the lines of, well, if we get enough of these outputs, and it sort of is like an anonymity set. I think that's probably what he was sort of leaning towards, but it actually sort of brings the worst of both worlds. It's like it makes it sort of coin join, like that footprint, that coin join identifiable footprint to Chip Mixer. And for whatever reason, he hasn't discontinued sort of those larger volumes. Maybe he did. Maybe if he did, if he said, okay, Mr. Kucoin hacker, your 400 Bitcoin that you jammed in through our mixer, you're going to get back 2 Bitcoin amounts. You're going to have 500 outputs. They would be like, well, fuck you, take a hike. I'm taking a hike. I'm going somewhere else. But it's like an 8 BTC amount, it doesn't make sense without like real sort of like liquidity requirements. And one last thing that I didn't really cover in the report is some of these custodial tumblers, they have reserves that they will inject into the mixer whenever liquidity gets low. It's like to keep people from mixing with themselves. I don't know if Chip Mixer does that. At least we didn't see that here. Blender advertises that. They say they have something like 4,000 Bitcoin in reserves or 5,000 Bitcoin in reserves, but we didn't see that here. But yeah, those very large amounts probably need to be discontinued. It's self-mixing, kind of thing.
Yeah, thank you.
Didn't Wasabi make a statement about liquidity?
I don't. Does Wasabi make a statement about anything? I don't know. Kind of there was a little bit of you can quickly mix and achieve some anonymity set, thanks to their unequal output amount mixing. That was sort of a thing that was thrown around when, Wasabi first introduced that unequal amount kind of mixing. And it's just a disaster. Those larger outputs are extremely rare. And I don't know if anybody over there is really keeping an eye on that. And it's a shame. Anything more than sort of 1 Bitcoin, I'm just spitballing here. Anything sort of more than 1 Bitcoin sticks out like kind of a sore thumb. I'm talking in terms of output size. There's just almost nobody mixing for 1.6 Bitcoin at this point. It's like ridiculous to still have that. It's like Chip Mixer. Why does Chip Mixer still have an 8.1, mix output? There's nobody there. And it's a shame that it just kind of carries on.
Cheers, Ergo. Great stuff.
Thanks, Dan.
No, it's fine. I was just making the point on the taint, but you basically covered me there. Just saying that kind of anything I've seen on taint was, for anyone mathematically applying anything, was kind of done on a first in, first out principle, and it's very difficult to apply anything like that on the Whirlpool transactions, because you've always got inputs from previous Whirlpool transactions, so you can't really apply any taint. That's the only thing I was going to say.
Thank you very much, guys. I'm out of here. Thank you very, very much. Very
Thanks for your
educational
questions.
Indeed. No problem. Thank you, pal.
Thanks, guys. Cheers. Bye.
Thank you all.
Bye, guys.